Welcome to Advocacy at 8. I'm attorney Sandra Jo Poland, your community legal advocate. Advocacy at 8 is my new YouTube legal video series launched October 1, 2018. Each video will educate you on an important legal issue. You and your community will be enlightened and empowered. Thank you for viewing Advocacy at 8. I am attorney Sandra Jo Poland, your community legal advocate. We've been talking for the last couple of videos on the topic, dying without a will, is it worth the cost? And we have been talking about the extremely high cost and unintended consequences of not taking the time and effort of putting into place a plan to protect and preserve your assets when you're transferring your wealth to the next generation. And the cautionary tales that we've been talking about really give us lessons on how things could have been done differently, what issues to look for and address in developing and drafting estate plans, so that the money in the estates could have been distributed to beneficiaries more smoothly, more quickly, and more effectively. We're wrapping up our discussion on the litigation surrounding James Brown's estate. We've been talking about how, because of paternity issues, whether the son who was 5 years old at James Brown's death was in fact his son, and how that paternity issue was not resolved during James Brown's life, probably because he didn't doubt that that was his son, but that after his death there were issues raised because his adult children and even his attorney said that during the 80s, James Brown had had a vasectomy. So, they questioned the parentage or the paternity of his son. Well, it was not resolved definitively while he was alive. James Brown was during his life, but they did have two paternity tests after his death, and it was conclusively proven then that James Brown II, who's now 17, is in fact the son of James Brown. But again, if there are any kind of paternity issues that have not been resolved, the key thing is to get those resolved as soon as possible, so that you won't have unintended consequences. You won't have all of these costs and litigation if something happens and you have to determine who's the proper heir. When Prince died, a lot of people said, okay, I'm the heir, I'm this sibling or whatever. Again, all of those issues you want to have resolved. And the same thing with the marital status. If your marital status is unclear, you need to resolve that as part of developing the estate plan. If you're going to give significant or even insignificant, if you're going to give anything to an heir or beneficiary, you need to determine, they need to determine, and if they're not going to determine, then you need to determine, because you're the one giving them assets, what their marital status is. Because if you're thinking you're going to give $1 million to your son and you think that he's widowed or he is divorced, when in fact he is not, that's something that you need to know before you give him that $1 million, because he's thinking that he's going to get that $1 million to himself. You're thinking you're going to give that to him so that he can have that to himself. And then his wife comes up and says, well, no, we're still married. So that needs to be resolved. And the money and the time you put in it up front is going to be well worth it, as opposed to fighting that out 12 years later in court, which is what James Brown's estate, his wife, Tommy Ray Heine, and his 6 adult children have done for the past 12 years. And in fact, the estate, even though the issue that Tommy Ray Heine was in fact James Brown's lawful wife at the time of his death, that was not resolved until July of this year, 2018. However, 4 of his adult children settled that back in the spring of 2018 because they said, money is just draining out of this estate. There's not going to be anything left to divide up if we continue to dispute these issues. Now, 2 of James Brown's adult sons are still fighting that, but the estate settled with Tommy Ray Heine back in 2009, and 4 of the adult 6 adult children, settled with her back in spring of 2018. The court said in July of 2018, yes, she is the lawful wife. She was the lawful wife at the time of James Brown's death. Because even though she was married to another man at the time she married James Brown, and that marriage was not annulled until after they got married. They got married. She married the man, Javed Ahmed, in 1997. She married James Brown in December 2001. Their baby was born in June of 2001. Her marriage to Javed Ahmed was not annulled until 2004. By then, there had been domestic incidents. They had separated. James Brown had put out a full-page ad in Variety magazine saying they were no longer together. Whether his attorneys thought that had legal significance, don't know. I don't know if they thought it was public notice, whatever, or what the significance was. Supposedly, Tommy Ray Heine had signed some document saying that she would no longer hold herself out as his wife, but she was just a companion, and she would not claim any common law rights. Well, I don't know if James Brown's advisors at the time thought that was enough to conclude that their marriage was no longer valid. But after 12 years of going through all different levels of courts in South Carolina, the appeals court affirmed a prior decision by the trial court and said, look, when Tommy Ray Heine married James Brown, she was free to marry him, because even though she had married someone and that marriage was still intact, the person she married had been married prior to marrying her to at least 3 women from Pakistan. So he was a bigamist as well. So not only was that first marriage invalid, that invalidated Tommy Ray's marriage to him. So therefore, she was free to marry James Brown. You have to sort of follow that. And because she was free to marry James Brown, that means their marriage was valid. And so James Brown thought that possibly at the time of his death, he was just living with Tommy Ray Heine and she was just his companion. No, she was his wife. And so therefore, when he died and his will was read, leaving everything to his 6 adult children, his 6 adult children said, okay, all of his estate goes to us, which is what he wanted in the will. It just so happens that South Carolina, just like probably all the other states, say that if you have a lawful wife at the time of your death and you fail to provide for her in your will, then the state's going to think it's some sort of you've overlooked providing for her. They're not going to allow you to overlook or not provide for your lawful wife. So they're going to say you get to elect a half of his estate, a share of half of his estate. And that's what she did. And she's been continually saying that she was his wife, getting that half of estate. And so the court finally said, yes, you're absolutely right. So again, the failure to really confirm, or at least mistakenly confirm, what the status of the marriage is, cost James Brown a lot. So thank you for listening, and we'll go on to talk about Whitney Houston and Bobby Christina Brown during our next series of videos.